impone di essere breve, se non brevissimo, ma una parola di ammirazione voglio dedicarla all'illustre collega Jonathan Simon. Io ho avuto modo di leggere il suo lavoro relativo al governo della sicurezza, della paura, della punizione, della criminalità. In realtà questo è lo spazio entro cui si muove il professor Simon. Anticipando notevolmente quello che poi è accaduto in Italia, dove tuttora abbiamo un problema di governo della criminalità, della paura, indotto probabilmente da una stampa ben pilotata, che si esprime, che è l'espressione di un populismo politico, ma io dico anche penale, sono la stessa cosa. Populismo politico e populismo penale sono esattamente la stessa cosa. Servono in qualche modo a recepire consensi intorno, mi verrebbe da dire, a pseudo problemi, come quello, non so, delle zingare che borseggiano nella metropolitana, oppure come il profilo relativo all'occupazione di immobili. Occupazione di immobili che viene enfatizzato da una stampa e non solo, anche da trasmissioni televisive che hanno la funzione, a mio parere, di occultare i veri problemi, andando a sollecitare le reazioni di pancia da parte dei cittadini. Grossi problemi relativi, non so, alla disoccupazione, povertà diffusa, impoverimento, problemi relativi alla migrazione, che invece di essere utilizzata come una risorsa, eppure noi abbiamo bisogno di risorse derivanti dall'immigrazione, viene visto come un problema di paura. Ci rubano le donne, ci rubano il lavoro, ci minacciano, Tutto questo, in rapporto anche ad una precarietà giovanile diffusa. Noi siamo un paese non solo di immigrazione, ma di emigrazione, di giovani che non trovano nessun tipo di risposta in questo contesto sociale. In realtà il collega Simon ce l'ha spiegato benissimo, e questo nel suo lavoro, e noi lo verifichiamo in questo momento come la dimostrazione di un teorema. Non si sente? No, vabbè, ma voglio sentire anch'io. I'd like to listen. Me too. Può tradurre?
Una bellissima in inglese.
E allora, arriviamo dunque al tema di questa sera. Il tema di questa sera che è strettamente legato a questa premessa. È legato a questa premessa perché se la pena, allora, punishment, se la pena, l'imprigionamento, la emarginazione servono a mantenere il consenso verso un potere non in grado di risolvere i veri problemi, allora già sappiamo qual è la funzione reale e qual è quella manifesta. Mito, si parla di mito. Allora io voglio parlare di un mito italiano. Chiedo scusa, I beg your pardon, but my daughter. Chiedo scusa. Mito della rieducazione. Re-education. Il mito, diciamo che nasce come menzogna nobile in Platone. Nella Repubblica la menzogna nobile di Platone è quella di convincere a mantenere la fiducia nei governanti. Lui distingue persone d'oro, persone che sarebbero i filosofi, i governanti, persone d'argento che sono i soldati, poi persone di ferro o di bronzo che sono contadini o artigiani. In realtà così lui cristallizza, con questa menzogna, cristallizza un apparato di potere che deve restare lì e quindi serve a questo Stato che deve garantire una convivenza. Allora, mito come menzogna nobile. Probabilmente, parlando di rieducazione, i legislatori costituenti hanno introdotto la rieducazione nella nostra Costituzione e in quel caso mi verrebbe da dire che si è trattata di una nobile menzogna, perché questi grandi legislatori sapevano benissimo qual era la realtà carceraria, avendola vissuta sotto il fascismo, sapevano benissimo che in realtà la sanzione era orientata a finalità deterrenti, di vendetta, come pare che oggi vogliano fare un'altra volta questi legislatori di derivazione fascista. No, di derivazione in che senso? Di derivazione post-fascista e che in tanti modi pare richiamarsi seriamente, forse attraverso dei lapsus, quando si parla di sostituzione etnica, o forse attraverso una tradizione che non si è mai spenta. Comunque era una nobile menzogna all'epoca della rieducazione, della Costituzione, perché si poteva pensare che di lì in avanti il regolamento carcerario fascista potesse essere poi superato nella realtà. Ora la rieducazione, a mio sommesso avviso, è un'ignobile menzogna, non è più nobile, per un motivo molto semplice, perché non viene perseguita nell'unica forma possibile. Qui sarebbe complicato in uno Stato laico, qual è il nostro. Rieducazione può significare tante cose, anche dal punto di vista etico, dal punto di vista politico, però nello Stato attuale, con una interpretazione costituzionale molto semplice, possiamo dire che rieducazione va intesa come integrazione sociale, come proposta di integrazione sociale. E questo non avviene. Questo non avviene per un motivo molto semplice, perché abbiamo una realtà carceraria che a tutto mira fuorché alla integrazione sociale, per considerazioni di carattere elementare, molto semplice, per sovraffollamento. Noi siamo stati bacchettati attraverso la Suleiman e la Torreggiani, poi perché il lavoro, non vi racconto episodi di cui sono stato testimone, ma il lavoro lavoro gratificante, quello che poi può dare una possibilità di inserimento sociale, sono realtà assolutamente minoritarie. La stessa cosa per quel che riguarda lo studio, la cura, e allora la menzogna diventa ignobile. Però deve essere in un contesto diverso, in un contesto dove la parola solidarietà e le parole diritti dell'uomo riprendano un significato, è l'unica via possibile per evitare un equivoco transatlantico, quello di chi, come negli Stati Uniti, abbandonato ogni prospettiva di integrazione, propone delle forme repressive che tutto hanno a che fare tranne che con i diritti dell'uomo, pur essendo la loro Costituzione un esempio storico e che avrebbe il suo significato anche ora, attualmente. Quindi, rieducazione, speriamo di capire, come ci spiegava già all'inizio il professor Simon, che è una questione politica. La funzione della pena è una questione politica, la realtà della pena è una funzione politica, e tra realtà latente e realtà apparente vince la realtà latente, fin tanto che poi non ci sarà necessità che i diritti dell'uomo vengano affermati, quando le condizioni politico-sociali renderanno impossibile una vita serena di coesistenza pacifica e di realizzazione dei diritti. Ho parlato sin troppo. Lascio volentieri la parola all'illustre collega Simon e al suo discussant, che poi non ho capito sto discussant in che senso, in senso inglese o in senso italiano, lo vedremo, lo acquisiremo dopo averlo ascoltato.
Come sarebbe in senso italiano?
Il senso italiano del sud, ecco, va bene.
Un disruptor.
Non lo so, lo vedremo. Lasciamoci sorprendere dalla vita, dal futuro, per chi ne ha. Io ne ho poco, però. Grazie.
Buonasera.
Buonasera.
This whole conference has been an extraordinary, or is being an extraordinary experience for me, and a fantastic honor and a pleasure. But it is really a special thrill to be presided over on a panel with somebody as distinguished as Professor Moccia, who I know has been a fount of critical understanding of criminal law and criminology within Italy and Europe more generally. So I'm deeply moved at your presence. Let me suggest that we've talked a little bit about my book, Governing Through Crime, and we've mentioned by way of passing a more recent, although no longer recent book, Mass Incarceration on Trial. In a way, this project, which is really on its way to being a book, is an attempt to sort of fix the correct the errors of those earlier books. I'm at a stage of my career where instead of writing new things, I'm correcting old things that I've said. So in Governing Through Crime, I treated the expansive growth of repression and its role in legitimizing political power as a phenomena of the late 20th century in the United States, sort of ignoring the deeper historical roots that shape people's belief in the criminal system as one that can produce social solidarity. In the book Mass Incarceration on Trial, I imagined that the inhumane scandal of California's super overcrowded prisons could bring our legal system to the point of rupture, where an abandonment or at least a significant transformation of the carceral state might be in the offings, of which I've been much disappointed. So this book is really an effort to make sense of the deeper sources of stability and durability of the carceral state. And let me be clear, I'm using the term carceral state here just as a shorthand to describe the very complex set of institutions, agencies, and actors that make up the criminal legal system and its adjacent systems like immigration, mental health. I find the term helpful to remind us with each breath that it is the state we're talking about and not some moral dispute among individuals that many criminal law professors in the United States prefer to think of criminal law as being about. So let me just give you a brief overview of what I want to talk about. First of all, I want to leverage that experience of having been wrong on so many occasions to try to generate something like a more general theory of the carceral state, how it develops, and how it endures, more importantly. And in doing so, I'm going to point to 5 what I call arcs of history. And the metaphor of an arc is intended to remind us that the past isn't behind us. It is in our present, and in some ways it comes to us from our future as well. And so unless we deal with these, I fear it'll be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to make headway toward transformational reform of the criminal legal system and the carceral state that it's given rise to. And I'm particularly interested in the role that what Foucault called political technologies have played in building the carceral state over time. And I'm going to talk about 5 of those political technologies that they don't originate in the criminal legal system, but have been, in effect, brought into the criminal legal system in order to grasp and control the problems that emerge from periodic crises of the political economy. And I'll flesh out this theory in a moment. But the 5 are sovereignty, and these are familiar concepts to some extent, which emerges in its modern form, I would argue, in the 12th century with the legal revolution that occurs with the rediscovery of Roman law and the reform of the church under Pope Gregory. The disciplinary political technology that is very familiar to many of us who were weaned on the scholarship of people like Dario Molossi and Massimo Pavarini, as well as Michel Foucault, that goes along with the birth of the prison in the 18th century, really beginning a bit earlier. Somewhat less well known, although maybe better understood by Italians because of the history that Professor Moccia referenced of eugenics, which I would argue is much more than just a technique of controlling reproduction. It is really a model of how to govern societies as biological racial entities that continues to linger today decades after the formal theory of eugenics was abandoned by biology and law. Expulsion, which is a difficult, I think, to characterize tendency that develops in the late 20th century around the world. We can think of lots of examples of it, of really pushing people out or removing them from societies or spaces in order to make those spaces more governable. And finally, I argue that racial governance, and particularly in the United States, anti-black racism, is itself a kind of a multi-historical period arc of a governance that has to be reckoned with as well, and begins certainly with the movement of bringing Africans as slaves to North America and Central America in the 17th century. So let me begin with a quote from the philosopher Nietzsche that I think really captures the sort of multi-arc construction of the criminal legal system, and therefore the impossibility of defining punishment in any decisive way with one idea, even though as philosophers of criminal law we often debate, is it, retribution, deterrence, reform? But the question of why do we punish and what drives the will to punish, as I would borrow Nietzsche's image to put it, is one that I think requires us to immerse ourselves in quite a bit of history. So I hope you had some coffee after your lunch and will be able to stay awake for this prolonged history lesson. But let me read the quote. The concept of punishment presents at a very late stage of culture, for example in Europe today, although he's talking about the 1890s or 80s, not just one meaning, but a whole synthesis of meanings. The history of punishment up to now in general, the history of its use for a variety of purposes, finally crystallizes in a kind of unity which is difficult to dissolve back into its elements. Difficult to analyze, and this has to be stressed, is absolutely undefinable. Today, it is impossible to say precisely why people are actually punished. All concepts in which an entire process is semiotically concentrated defy definition. Only something which has no history can be defined. And while I don't know if that's true of all institutions or all phenomena, as Nietzsche very greatly generalizes, I do think it's very much true of the carceral state. I also, in addition to Nietzsche, I want to sort of acknowledge the influence of the major works on the political economy of the carceral state, including Stuart Hall's work, which I mentioned in my previous lecture, my colleague Lloyd Facant, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, my own book, Governing Through Crime, Marie Gottschalk, and I couldn't find the right quote from any of those more esteemed people, so I just had to make one up, but I'm going to read it to you anyway. Over a millennium, the criminal law and court-ordered punishment of the convicted have become so integral to the meaning of the state and to capitalism that there is no economic or political crisis that is not translated into a crisis of crime and responded to with innovations or renovations of the carceral state. So to an important extent, I am anchoring my analysis in political economy, which is not to say that I deduce, or I hope I'm not deducing the necessary aspects of the carceral state from the logic of capitalism at any one time in a sort of classic Marxist approach, but rather following Molosi and Pavarini, seeing the political economy as a sort of horizon in which debates and struggles over the future of the carceral state move. And my metaphor here, the carceral cathedral, is not meant to be any kind of slam on Catholicism in particular or organized religion in general. As anyone who followed me around Sicily knows, I love cathedrals and spend as much time as I can wandering around and studying them. But I often tell my students in law school that when they go practice as public defenders or sometimes as prosecutors, that the criminal legal system they're entering is not just one thing in the present. Like a cathedral, it is something that has been built over centuries and incorporates not only multiple forms of architecture, but in some ways multiple theologies. So here's a kind of overview of this theory of penal change. And I'm simplifying here, but I hope I can elaborate with more detail in the particular instances. So generally speaking, I think the change in the carceral state is stimulated by some kind of political economic crisis that produces demand for a response to crime, that produces a sort of image of crime as the manifestation of the crisis and invites innovation or renovation of the carceral state as a solution. In seeking to make these innovations or renovations, the human beings and institutions that determine the carceral state turn to existing or emerging technologies of power in order to create new responses. And that produces institutions and laws. And finally, the myths that the title of my talk incorporates are important because most of these institutions and laws, whether it's the prison, whether it's forced sterilization of women during the eugenic era, come about as a result of changes that are by and large quite unpopular in their own time. People generally oppose them either because they see themselves as the victims or they actually resent losing the control they once had, right, over the processes of punishment. And by rational myths, I'm drawing on the institutionalist school of sociology, which reminds us that even the most Weberian rational organizations often adjust their behavior and develop structures of operation based less on instrumental, rational, objective concerns than on a need for legitimacy. In other words, even modern corporations are often more concerned that they are aligning themselves with prevailing myths about what enterprises or organizations of their type are supposed to do than they are with outcomes. To give you one quick example, why do all American universities have football teams? I mean, American football teams. I mean, there's nothing about football that is intrinsic to higher education. Indeed, from what we know about brain damage in that game now, it's almost a contradiction to have an organized form of neural injury promoted by universities. But if you ask administrators, they'll tell you that it's just not possible to have a legitimate university that doesn't have a football team. You know, the alumni would riot, the students would become dispirited, etc. So this is an example of a rational myth. It's not necessarily always false, but neither does it turn to empirical validity to establish itself. So I'm going to just kind of walk through these moments, and I'm going to, because history can be rather soporific, I will try to move with some dispatch. So I'm going to begin with what I consider the sort of big bang moment of the carceral state, right? And you'll recall, and I'm going to be grossly oversimplifying here, and one of the reasons it's taking me so long to finish this book is I know real historians are going to have a field day chopping this apart. Because anytime you're making claims about 1,000 years of history and how it operates, you're bound to be going beyond what they consider proper evidence. But this moment is one where the state, in a sense, appropriates to itself the power to punish. The crime moves from being a dispute among individuals, families, towns, vendettas, duels, etc., to an act of public justice. A crime becomes an injury to the king, to the sovereign, rather than to the individual that you have perhaps assaulted. And those of you that have studied Roman law, and I guess that's all of you, because in this continent, Roman law is often a required course of jurisprudence programs, not in the United States, will know that how important this moment is, because it really is the moment where law, as we understand it today, as a hierarchical set of norms that culminate in a lawmaker who's usually a singular apex, a structure, a parliament, a king, a communa, emerges as the fount of legal systems. The rediscovery of Roman law, although we don't really know if it was ever really lost or whether it just became more important as states sought to establish themselves, it purports to have disappeared into the Library of Bologna at some point and then been discovered by a clerk or something of that nature. But what's fascinating about it to me, and again, you have studied this, is not the norms of Roman law that are important to Europe's development in this period. It's the model of what a legal system looks like, how you teach it to people through textbooks and institutes. And indeed, the glossators, pretty much change all the norms to things that will fit the emerging economy of Europe in the late Middle Ages. But this vision of what a legal system is becomes incredibly compelling. And the Gregorian reforms of the church turn the church, the Western church, into really the world's first modern government in some ways. There's a pope who's the source of legality, right? There was, not that there was a dearth of law in the early Middle Ages. There was really too much law. There was, law in this city, law in that city, the law of this monastery, the law of that church. But this is a moment where that model that Weber will characterize later as legal rational domination is really conceived in a clear way. There's a fascinating story here of how sovereignty emerges and distinguishes itself from religious authority. As I learned from studying the posters within the Cathedral of Palermo, Federico II is a good example of this competition between popes and kings. And he himself often says, at least he's quoted as saying, I am the source of law. The Pope can talk to God, but I am the source of law here in the territorial piece of earth. And this is a very important shift, because up until that time, sovereigns had tried to claim that they really had some kind of deep connection to the divine. This is the era of the Crusades, and sovereigns spend treasure, blood, and their own lives sometimes attempting to enact a kind of forced invitation for a second coming of the Christ. But this is a moment where, in a sense, that gets stabilized. Kings are kind of clear that they're not the same as the Pope, but they are, in a sense, equally esteemed, because if they don't talk to God, they're at least the source of legality in their territory, which is at least divinely inspired. And this is an incredibly important moment for the accumulation of both capital and power, because once you establish courts that have a rigid hierarchy, all kinds of things are possible. You can harden the value of property, you can collect taxes more effectively, you can confiscate estates, and all of this is very important, I think, in developing the surpluses of power and wealth that are necessary for what we think of today as sovereignty and ultimately colonialism and capitalism. So that's, in a sense, the political economy story here. It's like the birth of political economy in some ways, because you need to have a state in order to develop an economy of the capitalist sort. Although it'll take centuries, I'm not claiming that capitalism emerged fully clothed in the 12th century, but that the means of creating that kind of economy began to accumulate. The institutionalization of this takes the form of the criminal law. And I think this is one of the reasons criminal law remains so important to us, is that if law is a kind of religion of the state, a substitute for the real religion, criminal law is sort of its most powerful and expressive ritual. Instead of having private parties pursuing vendettas and duels, engaging in ritualistic measures like contests to determine who is guilty of a crime, you begin to have the trial. You have kings, judges, judges that represent the king's power, prosecutors, and of course executioners. The trial is very important, and I won't diverge here, but once the public government becomes the source of legal authority to punish, the problem of whether or not you're really guilty becomes very important. If you have a vendetta, you don't really need to worry about proof of guilt. Whoever survives will be the innocent, and the dead person will be the guilty one. But once you have public justice, the prosecutor is not going to engage in a duel with the accused. You need procedures that will reassure you that you've got the truth. It's the moment when judicial torture, such as what's happening to Damien's here, that's actually his punishment, not his torture. Punishment is public, it is spectacular. This is a moment where punishment most serves the political economy by acting as a kind of ritual to recharge a potentially injured sovereign. And the myth that goes with this transition to public justice is what I call the myth that punishment repays a debt to society. And this is a very complex myth because obviously when two parties are disputing about a crime, it's easier to understand the idea of a debt. You've done some harm, one person's done harm to another, there is a debt to be collected. Once it becomes the sovereign that is the ultimate owner of that debt, it becomes very unclear how much the debt is, because if you've injured the sovereign, how much will it take to repay that? So it's a very important transition implied in this notion of debt, which we still honor today, right? When we say that so-and-so has paid their debt to society after they've served their prison sentence. The implication is that crimes unpunished leave the state and the law weaker than it was. In a way, that punishment is a perfect solution, right? Once you've punished, it's from the king's point of view, it's as if the crime never existed because they aren't personally injured and they have now reestablished their honor with the role of punishment. And the concern here is that failure to vigorously punish the guilty inevitably, through that weakening of sovereignty, leads to economic decline, political disorder, and ultimately social collapse. And if you want to see a remarkable image of this, I invite you, and maybe you've seen this since, I don't know where Siena is, but it's in Italy, I know that. This is the famous set of murals painted by Ambrogio Lorenzetti in the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena, which is often shortened to the allegory of good and bad government. And I'm not going to show you all the images, but this is the image of good government. And again, it's an allegory. So here you have justice, penal justice, as the sort of angelic figure seated in the throne, the female figure. She has got angels on both sides of her who are delivering justice, including beheading a guilty party, as well as civil justice as well. On the other side is a metaphor for the secular ruler. In this case, it's a kingly figure, but it's actually the Comuna of Siena, which is one of the world's first kind of city councils and quasi-democratic government. And the theme of punishment and its essential role in producing a good society runs through these murals. In between the female figure of justice who's delivering divine justice, you have the magistrates of Siena connecting justice to the secular political power. And aside them, at the bottom here, you can see figures in white who are bound offenders who are about to be punished, including some wearing the black cap, which is the usual symbol of capital punishment. And I won't show you the other murals here. You can Google them and look at them yourself. But there's another image of what society looks like when this is done properly, and it's prosperous, and people are trading and growing food and whatnot. And then there's a whole other set that shows what happens in bad government when justice is denied, and you have chaos, disorder, anarchy, etc. So again, I think this moment is a long way behind us in the 12th century, and of course it takes centuries for this idea of public justice to fill itself out. It's not like private dispute resolution goes away instantly. It's really a long process. There's an intriguing movie called The Last Duel, which purports to show the last duel in France, kind of midway through this transition in about the 14th century. But I think it's a moment where the potential growth of punishment, that's the Big Bang, as it were, is already there. It's not like the state has the resources to punish all the people. In fact, it can't even encounter or discover most crime. But the will to punish, the desire to punish, becomes a potentially limitless resource for the state. So let's turn to our second arc of history, the arc of discipline. And this could be described as the crisis of what Marx would call primitive accumulation. In about the 16th, 17th, 18th century, you have the problem of proliferating property crime. The earlier period, much more concerned with crimes of violence. This is as commercial society emerges, the possibility of the poor to literally seize hold of capital by stealing back their labor in the form of products either at the port or from stores, etc., is very real. You have revolts of the poor, and in his lectures called The Punitive Society, Foucault gives a lengthy treatment of the sort of early revolts that sort of anticipated and maybe laid the groundwork for the French Revolution later. You begin to have in this period the emergence of the dangerous classes, sort of accumulating poor and potential workers who are not adequately employed and who can be a source of chaos and revolution. And one of the first people to really kind of crystallize the theory of how to address this problem is the Scottish sort of business consultant and law enforcement expert Patrick Colquhoun, who writes a book called A Treatise on the Police of the Metropolis in 1796, which is usually considered one of the sources of the birth of the British police forces in the early 19th century. So that crisis of primitive accumulation, is addressed by the emerging forms of disciplinary power. And here's where Molossi and Pavarini are very helpful with their account of the workhouse, the Raspris, and other early European efforts to sort of contain and control the dangerous classes that aren't themselves initially judicial or penal in nature, but are essentially resources to rebuild the carceral state. The panopticon, which has been referred to by some of our interveners in the earlier session, is sort of a crystallization of how you use disciplinary power through surveillance, through forms of correctional training, and through close examination to sort of produce an obedient and what Foucault called a docile and useful subject. This gets institutionalized in forms like the prison, but also in the United States in the form of plantations in which enslaved people are held in very much panoptic conditions. This is the moment of the emergence of reformed penal codes, and of course the immortal Beccaria sort of captures much of the challenge to the political economy at this point. His book or essay on crimes and punishment is a very careful assessment of why the excessive punishment of the sort of sovereign ritual period is inadequate to deal with the real threat of especially property crime to the emerging society. And of course the police and the penitentiary, which Foucault will call chronotypical twins, that they're born roughly at the same time to address many of the same needs, are enduring forms of this institutionalization even today. So what's the myth of discipline? And this comes up in our discussions earlier, and I think we can find all kinds of evidence in our lives today. The myth that punishment reforms the idle. And who was I just talking to someone who was saying that, until the 80s, Italy had special measures against idle people as a sort of source of crime. And indeed, the idea that hard work can reform is one that remains very strongly today. I don't see Mario here, but he took me to a very interesting prison that some of you may know of in Reggio Calabria, a very specialized prison that only has about 60 people in it, and each of them is assigned to a particular workshop where they work with a master at becoming ceramic artists or wood makers, etc. And you could have lifted it from the pages of Discipline and Punish. And it's a reminder that the idea that we can sort of fix crime by getting rid of the idle habits of the poor is a myth that we have a very hard time getting rid of, even though we're no longer in a society that really needs to manufacture workers in the way that Dario Molossi described the early prison. After all, we have highly disciplined immigrants that are willing to take all kinds of risks to come to the door of our factory to work quite obediently if we allow them to do so. And so I would argue this is a good example of a sort of myth that has outlived any real political economic value. A classic illustration of this is maybe better known in the Anglo-American world. The artist William Hogarth, famous for many of his prints, did this whole series of plates called Idleness and Industry that follow the lives of two workers in an in a loom, working at looms in a clothing manufacturer, cloth manufacturer. One of them is industrious, and he eventually becomes Lord Mayor of London. The other is idle and starts to goof off, and he ends up being hanged at Tyburn, and they meet in the penultimate plate. But the idea here is that the idle poor are a permanent threat to property and order, something that we can observe, as I said, in both the United States and I suspect Italy today. And the related myth that habits of hard work and obedience can be inculcated by punishment. Let me turn to eugenics. So what's the political economy horizon in which eugenics will emerge as a kind of political technology? It's not primitive accumulation. Now we're talking about the crisis of mass production, sort of mature capitalism, monopoly capitalism, to use Lenin's phrases, in which you have giant factories like Henry Ford's River Rouge auto manufacturing plant, which is, I think, where Gramsci derived the term Fordism to describe this kind of highly organized form of capitalism. It is afflicted, that is in America at least, by a specter of mass immigration and also migration of African Americans up from the South. We see the concentration of capital in modern industrial corporations, and it's important to see that there's vulnerability there, right? The workers in the River Rouge plant have the potential to seize power, right? You've concentrated all the technology, and they have the skills needed to operate those machines. And so there really is a danger, this is Gramsci's regret, his lament while he's, in prison, that, the proletarian moment came and went, but it was there, and there was a real threat, as well as the radicalization of the working classes, which Americans blamed primarily on Italian and Jewish immigrants and Slavs as well, who were seen as racially unfit and the sources of contamination to the working classes. And so I think we have to really take a new look at eugenics as a technology of power. Francis Galton, a nephew of Darwin's, a polymath who comes up with statistical tests that we're still using today, as well as one of the inventors of police profiles. As you can see, he put himself through a mugshot and fingerprinting and things of this nature. So what are the basic elements of eugenics? Well, the idea that human biology should be the target of government. Unlike Darwin, we're not going to wait for natural selection. We are going to intervene in the biological marketplace of marriage and reproduction and make sure that the right people reproduce. And of course, that's a very controversial idea. And again, it's a comprehensive way of thinking about governing. It involves individuals, the idea that some individuals are degenerate or defective and that you can kind of pluck them out of society. Prisoners being a good example, but also this is a time when America creates a mass system of asylums to hold women mostly who are considered racially unfit and likely to produce defective offspring, and they're segregated and sometimes sterilized as a way to make sure that they don't diminish the sort of vitality of the biological mass. There's also a whole sort of mass or population-based governance idea here. This is the birth of immigration exclusion in the United States. Whole groups, mostly immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, all Asians, of course, all Africans, are considered undesirable elements in the US workforce. And so you get, efforts to contain and control whole populations. How does this get institutionalized? Well, I've already been elaborating some of the ways. And it's far-ranging, and I have to admit that I knew nothing, or not nothing, but I paid little attention to the role of eugenics in what Americans used to think of as the progressive era, the era that sort of invented reform, the regulation of industry, the protection of workers, so it has a rather benevolent appeal, even now, historically. But there's really a whole set of repressive measures that are sort of crystallized in this period that we've never quite let go of. So this is the birth of prohibition of alcohol. You may know how hard it is to amend the US Constitution. It's only been done, I think 32 times in over 200 years. Well, they amend the Constitution to give the federal government the power to criminalize alcohol consumption, the world's most popular sport. Totally unpopular among the masses, but the elites are unified. And partly it's because they see alcohol as a double attack on eugenic fitness. It causes degeneracy itself in the individual, and because it can be used to encourage racial mixing, it is a source of what is called racial suicide or racial poison by eugenicists. Again, if Eastern Europe and Southern Europe are sort of discharging its unfit masses on America, the best way to deal with that is cutting off immigration. And you go from essentially hundreds of thousands of people entering the United States through the port of New York in the early 1900s to hundreds after this cutoff. Because basically, unless you're from Northern Europe, there's a quota for how many immigrants can be allowed in that's based on the US Census in 1860, before mass immigration began. So when it was overwhelmingly a white, Protestant, Northern European population. This is the era of incarceration and sterilization of the intellectually disabled. This is Carrie Buck, labeled an imbecile, and the daughter of an imbecile, and the mother of an imbecile by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in the case Buck versus Bell, where in 9 paragraphs he upholds the sterilization of Carrie Buck, opining directly that it's better to sterilize her than wait to hang her offspring. This is the era of criminalizing race mixing. You might have thought that has a longer history, but after all, you know, people who owned human beings as capital, slaveholders, had no problem, you know, having sex with their property. It really is in the eugenic era that comes to be seen as a threat. It's a moment when sex work and deviant sex of all kinds is seen as a racial threat, and so it's criminalized. And ironically, it's also the moment when sort of rehabilitative penal measures like juvenile justice and probation are sort of invented. And we think of them still today as benevolent because they offer the possibility of rehabilitation and reform for the select. But remember, the other side of that was the other people who are going to be excluded, who aren't going to be allowed in the alternative measures, and now will have more resources and more room to repress them with prison. So the essential myth of eugenics is essentially that punishment is a form of eugenics. It's a way to remove the irreparably dangerous from society. Criminality, eugenicists would have said, stems from inherited disabilities, both physical and mental. Some whole races have much greater concentrations of these criminal traits: Jews, Italians, of course, blacks. And importantly, and this is the Lombrosian moment, crime science of some sort can help identify the dangerous minority among us and allow us to use individualizing measures like probation and juvenile justice to sort of snip out the bad and keep the good in society. A huge amount of the eugenic focus was on the so-called feeble-minded. They viewed this as the source of almost all our problems. Here you can see in a sort of a progressive era poster from Cincinnati in 1915, a rather deformed looking individual who's labeled feeble-minded. And feeble-mindedness was a sort of general spectrum. It was broken down into idiots, imbeciles, and morons. We still use some of those terms as insults. But as late as the 1930s, my father was labeled a moron by the New York public schools. Morons were very threatening because they looked like the rest of us, and they were considered to be oversexed and promiscuous, and therefore they would really spread their bad seed, as it were. In some ways, my dad lived up to that. He was a radical communist and a labor organizer. He also eventually got a PhD from the University of Chicago, so maybe not such a great fit. But in any event, as you can see in the wheel here, that imbecile is, as they put it here, hub to our wheel of vice, crime, and pauperism. All of our problems, the house of refuge, the police court, the workhouse, the city hospital, all are radiating out from the pernicious influence of the intellectually disabled. So now I'm moving to the late 20th century, and again, I apologize for sort of leapfrogging, as it were, through history in these long arcs, but this must come to an end at some point. So what's the political economy sort of horizon for the moment that really produces mass incarceration and what I thought was governing through crime, although you can see all of this is governing through crime in some important ways? It's really the crisis of Keynesian capitalism, the sort of a fully developed form of Fordism based on government intervention in the economy, use of tax funds to stimulate the economy during times of economic depression that John Maynard Keynes, the economist, is best associated with. In America, this is associated with deindustrialization. Some people say we sent our industries over to Europe to keep it from going communist, but in any event, they disappeared from Detroit and Chicago and places like that, leaving behind a kind of underclass of former workers who no longer had a direct relationship to labor. This is the moment when unions and other forms of worker power are disassembled and undermined by mostly legal changes. This is the moment of urban revolts against policing mostly. This is the popularly known as the Watts Riot, the Los Angeles Revolt of 1964, which is a pivotal moment for sort of galvanizing the war on crime. There is a genuine growth of violence and drug addiction, perhaps because of the Asian wars that the US is fighting at the time and the traumatic impact that those wars have on the mostly working class people who have to fight them. It's the moment when the middle class is subsidized by the government to move to all-white suburbs where they'll be safe from these declining cities, and what's left of the poor are stripped of much of their welfare benefits, leaving them even more precarious and perhaps dependent on things like crime. So again, of all the technologies of power I've talked about, I'm sort of the least confident that we can really define expulsion. The geographer Saskia Sassen uses this term and argues that you can see it all over the world with indigenous people removed from rainforests and other places for primary extraction of their resources, but also in America's urban centers, which are facing all of these problems associated with deindustrialization. There's a real effort to remove the poor in order to lay the foundation for sort of revitalizing the cities, turning them into sort of post-industrial hubs of what we think of them today as technology, finance capital, higher education. So just to give you an example, the University of Chicago and NYU in New York, both in the 1950s seriously discussed moving to the suburbs. Like, middle-class people are not going to send their kids to Chicago or New York. Ironically, of course, today, after the success of that removal approach and the revitalization it helped to allow, those are very popular universities that make a good deal of money by trading on their urban ambience. Slum clearance is a big part of this, maybe a bigger part than mass incarceration. Most of the freeways that you'll find if you drive in American cities that cut right to the center of the city were located where they could remove the maximum number of African Americans from their homes. It's also a time of permanent war and mass induction into the military for some. How does this get institutionalized in the carceral state? Mostly in the form of mass incarceration, represented here by California's rate of imprisonment, which you see explode from about 100 people per 100,000 in 1978 when I was a college student to a peak of about almost 500 per 100,000 between 1998 and 2008 before it comes down. This is the downward slope is the part that made me want to write the book Mass Incarceration on Trial, because I thought it was going to keep going. It hasn't. We see a massive expansion of police forces in both size and their proactive pursuit of likely offenders. I showed you earlier the slide of stop and frisk. A huge increase in arrest for minor offenses like drugs, systematic use of discretion, which the eugenic era had encouraged the system to develop, to expand incarceration. It's as if the redeemable had shrunk and the irredeemable had grown, and the same eugenic logic now justified keeping many of them in prison. And I'm sorry I hacked the last part of my bullet point off there. I'm not sure what that's supposed to be. So what's the myth of expulsion? The idea that punishment, in effect, can contain the spread of high crime neighborhoods and reinforce the sort of pro-social middle-class norms that will keep white middle-class people in the cities, lead to gentrification, etc. This illustration accompanied the very influential article by James Q. Wilson and George Kelling, Broken Windows, which gives rise to the logic of policing that gets called broken windows. And I think this illustration actually does a very good job. It actually appeared in the magazine with the article, and I'm starting to do some research on the cartoonist, who was obviously very prescient. But you can kind of see a storm of crime happening in this neighborhood, right? Where the red car is, you see a sex worker seeming to solicit business. You see an inebriated man sort of sitting, maybe just having consumed some drugs. On the other side, you have sort of a riot in progress, a robbery in progress, etc. And in the middle of it all is a police officer. And part of the point is he's not there to sort of arrest the dangerous criminal. He's there to sort of address these disorderly behaviors that are leading to a kind of decline of urban sociality. And I think broken windows policing has to be put together with mass incarceration to fully appreciate this expulsion strategy. So you use broken windows policing to kind of lift the burden of low-level crime from the neighborhood and keep some of those people in jail and others kind of in orbit around the jail so that you can incarcerate them eventually. And then you use the prisons to sort of expel larger numbers. Is a little bit, I think, like, unfortunately, Israel's strategy in containing Palestinians, something that Malcolm Feely and I wrote about 30 years ago, by using incarceration to sort of hold a significant portion of the potentially militant population. The idea here is that prisoners can't really be reformed, but they can be removed. And the idea that more punishment is less crime has become an enduring myth in America. Finally, the arc of racial governance, or anti-blackness, begins, of course, with the permanent crisis of slavery. I mean, slavery involves kind of a inherently risky situation. You've got a population that you're forcing to labor under threat of violence, and of course the potential for them to turn that violence on you is enormous. They invent things like the slave patrol, so they're an early form of constant surveillance at night to see if there are slaves potentially joining together in rebellion. After the end of slavery, you get the convict lease system, which allows African Americans to be convicted of various crimes and then sentenced to forced labor, usually to death, in private factories and farms, and ultimately in our time, mass incarceration. And I've illustrated this here with a famous diagram of a slave ship, the Brooks, in the late 18th century. And as a number of historians, including Simone Brown, have pointed out, it's kind of like a panopticon. It's a panopticon that's designed to be sort of hidden under the boards of the ship. And Brown actually claims, she has evidence that Bentham, on his way back from Russia, where he got the idea for the panopticon from his brother, is on a slave ship. Not a big slave ship like this, but a ship that has, according to Simone Brown, something like 20 African-American women, or they're not American yet, enslaved women under the boards of the deck. Racial governance can be thought of as a political technology. It's a way of surveilling this dangerous population. It involves new forms of government like the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a Reconstruction-era government agency intended to resolve disputes between the formerly enslaved and the white population. It devolved into the Ku Klux Klan and the terroristic system of lynching, and ultimately Jim Crow segregation in much of the mid-20th century. This gets, there we go. How is this institutionalized? Well, I've already gotten ahead of myself and named many of these things: the slave patrol, the black codes, the convict lease system, the chain gang, discretionary justice, which excluded African Americans from any of the benevolent measures, and ultimately mass incarceration. And what's the myth that goes with racial governance? The ironic myth that punishment manages racial diversity, right? So here's the paradox that America in the 1960s legally embraces full equality for black people, finally makes it a civil rights law that you can't discriminate in employment or education, creates an end to spatial segregation as a matter of law, and then embraces mass incarceration as a way to manage that increasingly diverse society. And you get a number of, corollary ideas. The sociologist Herbert Blaylock coins the phrase racial threat hypothesis because he thinks that when states and cities adopt harsh penal measures, they're really signaling the white population that they can contain and handle the growing demographic and political power of black people. We've seen, and it's still a problem, a sort of epidemic in school discipline in integrated schools. So black people get to go to schools with whites, but they find themselves sent out or expelled at high levels. And basically the idea that gentrification of traditionally black neighborhoods requires intense policing, such as the stop and frisk that is depicted in this picture from the early 2000s. So let me summarize the sort of myths, because the reason I'm focusing on the myths is, the technologies of power are important. The institutions, of course, are important. The political economy, interestingly, kind of goes away. It doesn't disappear, but each crisis has its own historical distinctiveness, which you might think would wane in its influence. It's one of the reasons I thought we were done with governing through crime, because we were sort of through the crisis of post-Keynesianism, post-Fordism. But it turns out that myths mean that the punitive desires that are created in order to justify the new institutions at each stage of the history continue to provide legitimacy and support for not reducing the scale of the carceral state over time. Those myths, to recap, are that punishment repays a debt to society, that punishment reforms the idle, that punishment removes the irreparably dangerous from society, that punishment reinforces the social norms of good neighborhoods, and that punishment manages racial diversity. And I think, my claim is that if you explore debates about punishment and reform in America today, you will see versions of each of these myths continuing to serve their purpose of dissuading the public from accepting any substantial retrenchment of the carceral state. So here's where I kind of turn to you for whether this makes any sense and whether there's a possibility of comparative research here. Acknowledging that criminologists are over-optimistic in their ability to sort of measure how punitive a society is, it's a lot more complicated than the incarceration rate or the imprisonment rate. But I want to make the claim, even if I can't document it quantitatively, that sort of the fewer myths a society has embraced, the less punitive it'll be, or at least the less reluctant it'll be to consider giving up penal measures. Look at the US, we've never given up a significant penal measure. Basically, we're still executing people here in the early 21st century. And here I would be really interested in some Italian collaborators, because after all, the US is probably the #1 country in the world to embrace eugenics. Second would be Nazi Germany. James Whitman, not with a Q, the Yale legal historian, has a book called Hitler's American Model, in which he argues that when Hitler came to power, his primary concern that America was so far ahead in eugenics that they would outcompete Germany for supremacy of the world. He adopted even more extreme forms, so not enough to segregate the disabled, let's exterminate them. So the beginning of genocidal behavior in Nazi Germany was against the disabled. What I don't know much about is how eugenics was looked at by Italian fascism. And since the Italian Penal Code, as I understand it, receives its foundational formation in the 1930s under fascism, it would be really interesting and maybe somebody's already done scholarship on this, to look at sort of eugenic elements in the 1930 or 30s code. A second sort of hypothesis for comparative work is that the political technologies themselves, sovereignty, discipline, racism, expulsion, can have stronger or weaker forms, can be more or less compromised. And I would argue that America has sort of diminished none of these. I mean, think about sovereignty. We don't accept the sovereignty of the United Nations. We wouldn't accept anything like the European Union setting limits on our ability to go to war when we want to, or to make laws when we want to. And I was struck when we visited prisons here, and this is a banal point, because it's true of all levels of government in Italy. When you see a prison governor, she's sitting in front of two flags, the Italian flag and the flag of the European Union, and they're at equal height, which tells you symbolically that Italian sovereignty has in a sense been compromised by the existence of the European Union as a kind of sovereignty. So I would argue again that the weaker the political technology becomes in its sort of, or the more diluted it becomes, diluted it becomes, not diluted, the less punitiveness. So take discipline again. You know, the discipline is inherently the power of either direct control or economic control to force you to labor, no matter how unpleasant and unrewarding it is, lest you and your family starve. It's welfare that ultimately dilutes that, to have a guaranteed income, which I believe is possible for many Europeans, at least in the richer countries of Western Europe, is to produce at least some autonomy from the discipline of wage labor, gives you some choices. And of course, America has diminished and eliminated the various weak forms of welfare that we ever had. So we've again done nothing to diminish discipline, which is one of the reasons we have huge unhoused population today. And my final sort of hypothesis is that when there is a crisis of the carceral state, brought about by any kind of combination of things, an escape from prison, a riot in prison, humanitarian disasters in prison, scandals by the police, maybe they kill or rape people, what you will see is when the demands for reform are raised, is essentially raising the flags of these different myths. So in California today, after the sort of crisis of mass incarceration that I tried to describe in Mass Incarceration on Trial, our new liberal war on crime governor, Gavin Newsom, is proposing to transform our prisons into Norwegian-style reentry centers. And good luck with that. But again, what it suggests is saying that prisons are about reform is a way to re-legitimize them after their promise of being containers of punishment has sort of run out of political steam. Finally, and you know, I know it's not a popular stand in Europe, and maybe because you have succeeded in reducing the punitiveness of your system, I increasingly think that the only serious reforms that we can undertake in America are ones that are guided by at least the horizon of abolition, trying to imagine a world that simply doesn't rely so much on police and prisons to maintain order. I think we can derive some insights from this analysis for that project. The first point would be, don't just focus on the latest carceral expansion and its myths. That's what I did in essentially governing through crime, is treat the mass incarceration period as singular and distinctive. Excuse me. Secondly, you need to attack the myths themselves and not just the institution. So don't just go up against the police or the prison system. You need to call out the myths that they promote to justify themselves. And finally, at least in America, and this may differ in different places, abolition or transformative reform must be part of a broad social justice, racial justice agenda that aims at nothing less than upending racial capitalism, which is to say the ongoing economic value of racism in a society. And in California, and this is one of my sources of optimism, we really are seeing some changes in this direction. Governor Newsom, to his credit, appointed a commission on reparations to consider whether California should provide financial or other compensation to African Americans who could trace their families to enslavement. And very importantly, in 2020, at the height of the racial justice movement, California enacted a Racial Justice Act that allows attorneys throughout the state to essentially raise racial discrimination to any level of punishment or penal treatment, and to use multiple methods, including discourse, history, as well as statistics, to prove it. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Grazie, caro collega. Allora, io devo dare la parola al discussant, ma vorrei trovare solo qualche parola chiave che attraversa tutto il discorso. E abbiamo espulsione, eugenetica, espulsione, cattedrale carceraria, poi ancora legame con economia politica, debito, retribuzione. Debito è curioso perché in tedesco debito è Schuld che vuol dire colpevolezza, quindi si riesce a trovare questa parola sia come debito che come colpevolezza, da annullare attraverso la pena, secondo modulazioni idealistiche. Poi ancora classi pericolose, in particolare operai, disciplina, oziosi e vagabondi che ci esistono ancora, sono i migranti e gli emarginati, sono degli archetipi che passano durante tutta la storia, facili da escludere, facili da incarcerare. Poi l'incrudelimento rispetto ai disabili, quindi la sterilizzazione, l'uccisione. E qui Hitler probabilmente è stato più efficiente perché ha creato delle istituzioni, i lager, dove si è scientificamente proceduto a questo. Ritorna tecnologia del potere, incarcerazione di massa, gentrificazione, governare attraverso il crimine, e ritorna attraverso tutte le epoche di sviluppo precapitalistico, protocapitalistico, e siamo arrivati al contemporaneo e non è cambiato molto. Ora per fortuna ci ha parlato di problema welfare con crisi dello stato carcerario, abbattimento dei miti, che possiamo intendere quindi come ignobili bugie, ignobili menzogne che servono a tutt'altro scopo rispetto a quello per il quale viene raccontato un mito. Poi sicuramente l'unica riforma è un progetto importante di giustizia sociale, razziale. Per quel che riguarda il fascismo posso dirle che rispetto al disagio mentale vi era un largo uso di manicomi che come istituzione totale, un'istituzione totale che tendeva a conservare la malattia, a distruggere gli individui come soggetti non funzionali e pericolosi. Dobbiamo attendere solo gli anni 70 per un cambiamento radicale. Per quanto riguarda il fascismo, posso dire semplicemente la presenza di un diritto coloniale che era esattamente l'opposto dello Stato di diritto, con presunzione di colpevolezza, un solo grado di giudizio, diffusività di pena di morte per mantenere fermo lo Stato coloniale. Ho parlato fin troppo e devo dare la parola. È un piacere conversare con lei. Do la parola al mio illustre collega nella sua funzione. Illustre, però, you have forgotten to say illustre. My illustrated collega Antonio Cavaliere per la sua discussione. Grazie.
Buonasera a tutti. Sono felice di essere qui, onoratissimo di aver ascoltato quale Discussant la relazione magistrale sto ascoltando la traduzione. No, la devo ascoltare perché così per i tempi, per non mettere fretta. E dopo che ha parlato anche il mio maestro Sergio Moccia, non so bene cosa ci faccio qui. E quindi comincerò con una domanda al pubblico, perché saluto i colleghi che conosco nelle prime file, ma non conosco quelli che sono nelle altre file. Siete studenti studiosi di diritto penale? Quanti studiosi di diritto penale? Alzino la mano. Ok. Sociologi, criminologi? Ecco.
Vabbè, uno faccia finta.
Questo lo immaginavo. Io non so se vi è già capitato di sentire una lezione magistrale di criminologia critica o di storia della politica criminale. La mia impressione è che i penalisti, non da oggi, ma da quando esiste il tecnicismo giuridico, ignorano completamente che esista un sapere diverso e critico sul sistema penale, che non consiste nell'oggetto della scienza giuridico-penale secondo Arturo Rocco. Poche settimane fa un amico professore di diritto penale di scuola milanese mi ha chiamato per complimentarsi per un lavoro che avevo scritto e mi ha chiesto: senti, ma che cos'è la criminologia critica? Mi puoi mandare qualche riferimento bibliografico? E questi sono, diciamo, gli esponenti del pensiero penalistico dominante in Italia in questo momento. Quindi è molto importante ascoltare un pensiero critico di così ampio respiro, per sapere che esiste qualcosa di diverso e per pensare che può esistere qualcosa di meglio del diritto penale. E della pena detentiva in particolare. Ma in Italia, se parli di diritto penale minimo con i colleghi, la reazione migliore che puoi incontrare è un sorrisetto bonario e una pacca sulla spalla. Neppure la riforma Cartabia tanto celebrata contiene un progetto sia pure embrionale di depenalizzazione. Neppure la riforma Cartabia prevede pene principali diverse dalla detentiva. Il sistema di riferimento di questi grandissimi penalisti che siedono nei posti di potere in Italia o non può o non vuole una reale alternativa allo stato di cose attuali. Io faccio il discussant, quindi le mie considerazioni sono estemporanee, per cui vi chiedo scusa per la carente organicità. Ora, premesso che io sono d'accordo con quasi tutto ciò che ha detto il professor Simon, noi penalisti orientati nel senso del diritto penale come estrema ratio, del diritto penale conforme a principi costituzionali, da Stato sociale di diritto, possiamo fare un lungo percorso comune con l'abolizionismo. Questo lungo percorso comune è la critica dell'esistente, come mirabilmente descritto dal professor Simon. Però abbiamo parlato finora di miti e io comincerei a parlare un po' di utopie. Parliamo di Imagine, forse la canzone più bella mai scritta. Si è parlato di Mick Jagger, per me John Lennon, tutta la vita. In quella canzone sicuramente. Allora, qui parlo davanti a maestri della storia del diritto penale e quel poco che so l'ho imparato in particolare da Sergio Moccia. Ma diciamo l'utopia, se per me in diritto penale la farei cominciare da Grozio, cioè dall'idea del de iure belli ac pacis. La pena è una cosa orribile, è un male, la guerra è un male, ma Grozio che avversava il diritto penale del tempo e le guerre del tempo, guerre di religione o con pretesti religiosi, come ne vediamo ancora oggi, non parla di abolire il diritto, ma parla di un diritto che valga in tempo di pace e in tempo di guerra. È un diritto orientato innanzitutto alla tutela dell'uomo, i diritti umani, la difesa dell'uomo dal potere statuale. E questo poi, insomma, in via molto imperdonabilmente schematica e banalizzante ci porta all'illuminismo. E qui c'è ancora un'idea di libertà dell'uomo, di eguaglianza e di fratellanza. Oggi la chiameremmo solidarietà, probabilmente. Su queste basi non si parla di abolire, si parla di costruire un sistema, anche un sistema penale, coerente con quei principi. E questo, per esempio, ha portato al contrasto alla pena di morte, al contrasto alla tortura, alle pene corporali, a pene diseguali a seconda della provenienza sociale dell'autore. E anche a porsi il problema di che cosa può essere punito. Non possono essere punite condotte immorali, non possono essere punite mere opinioni, e Beccaria dice delle cose molto importanti su cosa si può fare di non penale rispetto ai reati commessi dai poveri, al ruolo della cultura nella prevenzione dei reati. Quello di Beccaria è un diritto penale dell'estrema ratio. Allora, io difendo il mito del diritto penale dell'estrema ratio, che poi con un passaggio molto importante. Poi la visione della storia, secondo me, dovrebbe essere parolone, insomma, deve contemplare passi avanti e passi indietro. Il passo indietro della restaurazione, del diritto penale cosiddetto liberale, che poi è un diritto penale del privilegio, come è stato autorevolmente scritto, l'involuzione del diritto penale fascista, dove la legalità era quella del partito unico fascista. La religione cattolica come religione di Stato era presidiata penalmente, vilipendio della religione cattolica. La mendicità era elevata a reato, i poveracci finivano in galera con quella disciplina vergognosa del furto che ancora oggi abbiamo. E poi la tradizione difficile, dura a morire del diritto penale della disobbedienza. Molto dura a morire perché ci sono ancora oggi professori di diritto penale che in manuali molto autorevoli scrivono che esistono reati con l'offesa e senza offesa. Quindi per alcuni si punisce se c'è l'offesa. Altri si possono punire per condotte innocue. Cerco di recuperare un po' di ordine e mi avvio verso la conclusione. questo pure si può tradurre, se mi sente. Il diritto penale della Costituzione è un diritto perché parte da un modello di Stato sociale di diritto. Diritti della persona, eguaglianza non solo formale ma anche sostanziale. Bisogna rimuovere gli ostacoli all'eguaglianza. Ci vuole per tutti i ragazzi di Napoli la possibilità di avere un'istruzione come gli altri. Ci vuole per tutti la possibilità di accedere a un reddito dignitoso, diritto al lavoro, diritto alla sussistenza, diritto alla casa. Il diritto penale della Costituzione è questo. Innanzitutto facciamo tutto quello che non facciamo per prevenire la criminalità. E poi interveniamo, se necessario anche penalmente, ma in via di estrema ratio, con principi uguali per tutti, conformemente al principio di legalità, che è la legalità parlamentare, non quella dell'uomo solo, della donna sola al comando. Puniamo solo condotte offensive di beni giuridici, secondo però una gerarchia, cioè dei rapporti relativi tra i beni che rispecchi un ordinamento fondato sul primato della persona. Allora, tutto questo non è stato attuato. Non è stato attuato. Solo negli anni 70 ci sono state delle riforme parziali orientate a Stato sociale di diritto. Penso alla riforma dell'ordinamento penitenziario, che fondamentalmente, azzardo un'ipotesi, si fonda su due idee: quella di alternative alla pena detentiva e quella di una pena detentiva che, anche se è quella, deve essere orientata a reinserire socialmente. E queste sono due idee di estrema ratio e di Stato sociale. Ma non c'è stata una riforma complessiva, e dagli anni 90 in poi abbiamo avuto il ritorno del securitarismo. Il securitarismo è il gendarme del neoliberismo. L'ideologia per cui i ricchi devono stare meglio e i poveri devono stare peggio. E se qualcuno si ribella deve essere castigato. La storia della ipercriminalizzazione negli Stati Uniti, in Europa e in Italia coincide con l'avvento del neoliberismo. E voi che siete bravi penalisti, leggete, mi rivolgo ai giovani ovviamente, leggete il libro di Massimo Pavarini, pubblicato come numero monografico della rivista Unibo, che comincia con un giro mondo penitenziario, in cui si mostra proprio il nesso tra la ritirata dello Stato sociale e quindi l'aumento delle diseguaglianze, nella povertà, ma anche dell'isolamento sociale, perché con l'avvento del neoliberismo muore anche l'idea di una società fatta di comunità di persone che si parlano. Che viene sostituita dalla persona in rapporto con un dispositivo e con i suoi consumi. Tra l'altro una persona più facilmente sorvegliabile e influenzabile. Ora, tutto questo è stato studiato da maestri come Simon, ed altri esponenti della criminologia critica. E lo sappiamo qual è la risposta da dare. Secondo me è quella che ha indicato più o meno 20 anni fa da Alessandro Baratta, che diceva: se vogliamo un'alternativa che serva a tutelare davvero i diritti dell'uomo, dobbiamo sapere che esistono 3 politiche corrette e una sbagliata. La prima alternativa corretta è quando c'è un conflitto sociale, non fare nulla. Per esempio, se c'è un dissenso politico, fa parte della democrazia, anzi è il sale della democrazia e non va criminalizzato. Ma Baratta diceva anche c'è una seconda politica corretta: fare altro dal diritto penale. La prevenzione primaria, sociale, culturale, anche istituzionale, da Beccaria in poi è risaputo che è il modo migliore per contrastare, per affrontare i conflitti sociali laddove si pongono, e non usare il diritto penale come alibi per la mancanza di una politica diversa. La terza alternativa corretta che disegna Baratta è quella di usare il diritto penale, ma mai da solo. Io non so se abbiamo trovato qualcosa di meglio per prevenire e per contrastare la tortura, per esempio. Io non sono tra i sostenitori della necessità di introdurre il reato di tortura, perché ci sono tante fattispecie applicabili. So che è impopolare, ma è quello che penso. Ma ammettiamo che sia necessario prevedere il reato di tortura. Introdurre solo il reato di tortura senza fare della prevenzione extrapenale, per esempio, molto semplice, rendere possibile identificare gli autori delle torture, stiamo facendo un diritto penale simbolico, perché neanche con il nuovo reato di tortura i macellai di Genova del 2001 sarebbero punibili. E questo non solo perché la fattispecie è scritta male, ma anche perché non si è fatto niente per obbligare le forze di polizia a essere identificabili e per far sì che funzionino i controlli disciplinari e le sanzioni disciplinari. Ok. Ma tutto questo è un programma politico-criminale. E per seguire un programma politico-criminale ci vogliono dei principi, e li abbiamo perché sono quelli della Costituzione, ma ci vuole un sistema conforme a questi principi, e quindi ci vuole una dottrina penalistica che pensi per sistemi. E non secondo il diritto vivente. Ma ci vuole anche un referente politico. Un referente politico che sia orientato alla Costituzione e che abbia una visione ideologica, che abbia una visione sistematica, coerente con dei principi di fondo, perché questa è l'ideologia. Quello a cui assistiamo oggi, cioè lo slogan della morte delle ideologie, è a sua volta un'ideologia, e cioè l'ideologia del laissez-faire, l'ideologia del navigare a vista, che non è altro che l'ideologia della conservazione del potere per chi ce l'ha già. Grazie.
Complimenti per la bella discussione, per gli spunti di discussione. Facciamo una pausa, il tempo di una sigaretta, ecco, per chi fuma, un caffè, un dolcino, dipende, a chi piace qualunque cosa, ad libitum.